Hey guys! Tonight we're walking down a cobbled medieval street, lantern light flickering on wet stones, the air heavy with wood smoke and the faint smell of bread cooling in the market stalls. You can almost hear the squeak of cartwheels, the shuffle of boots, and the hushed whispers that carry from the darker corners. It's not the bread sellers that draw the magistrate's sharp eye tonight. It's the doorways glowing with soft light where laughter spills out, where rules are thick and fines are heavier. Bread may feed a city, but brothels, oddly enough, carried more ink in the city law books. And you probably won't survive this world anyway. Between the bad sanitation, the bubonic rats, and the price of stale rye, you'd be gone before your Wi-Fi finished loading. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing you notice trudging under those lanterns is how ordinary the clash of rules feels. There's no great drama about a baker being fined for shaving an ounce off the loaf, just a bored clerk writing a mark in a ledger. But if a brothel opens too close to a church, suddenly entire councils meet. Bishops send letters and scribes rush to draft ordinances. Bread is the daily, silent fuel. Brothels are the noisy, moral, taxable sore spot. And somehow, for medieval officials, noise and spectacle always demanded more paperwork than nourishment. You picture yourself standing at a street corner, the law books of the town spread out in your imagination. One page is the assize of bread and ale, famously setting weights and prices. If grain is scarce, bread shrinks. If grain is cheap, it grows. A practical sliding scale. The other page, dozens of clauses about where a board may operate, which colours her girls may wear, how often they must bathe, what fines apply for violence inside, and even which days they must close. You can almost feel the imbalance, one subject tied to survival, the other tied to sin, yet the latter gets the fatter scroll. A mainstream fact comes to mind. In 13th century England, the assize of bread and ale was one of the earliest national laws regulating everyday goods, but enforcement mostly stayed local and dull. Bread weighed out, scales checked, fines levied, it worked quietly. Meanwhile, quirky tidbits surface. In some towns, sex workers had to wear striped hoods or yellow veils so customers and constables could identify them instantly, almost like medieval neon signs stitched into fabric. Historians still argue whether these dress codes were more about humiliation or simply about guiding traffic, but either way, no baker had to wear a funny hat for selling underweight rye. You let your imagination drift into the brothel itself. Warm light, laughter, music, and a sense that the rules here are an odd mixture of control and tolerance. Authorities weren't exactly endorsing pleasure, they were managing it. A necessary evil, they might whisper, to keep young men from worse sins, to keep disorder contained to predictable districts. You can almost hear the paperwork shuffling in the background, lists of names, licenses, maybe even secret notes passed between guild officials and town watchmen. Compared to that, a baker's ledger is sleepy stuff. And so you walk on, cobbles underfoot, eyes adjusting to shadows. The city itself hums like a body with two heartbeats, one steady and nutritional, the bread that sustains everyone, the other erratic and scandalous, the stew houses that keep officials and priests endlessly debating. You pass by a baker closing shutters, no one really caring whether his loaf is exactly the lawful weight tonight. Across the lane a constable lingers near a doorway watching, making sure every rule about who enters and what clothing is worn is obeyed. The imbalance is palpable. You can almost smile at the irony. Bread, the literal staff of life, got slim columns of law. Brothels, risky diversions, got thick chapters. As you drift along, you realize this story isn't just about laws, it's about what authorities feared might unravel society. A bad loaf might annoy you, a brothel out of control might shake faith, stir violence, or even bankrupt the city if taxes were missed. And so the weight of law leaned where the noise was loudest, not where the hunger was deepest. The lanterns flicker lower, your footsteps soften, and the cobbles seem to echo less sharply now. The first layer of the paradox has been laid out for you. Survival food with simple rules, scandalous pleasures with endless ordinances. The night promises more stories, more alleyways, more gentle absurdities to carry you forward. You keep moving with the street's rhythm, the flickering lamps guiding your gaze to quieter corners where bakers finish their work. The bread has already been pulled from the ovens, the scent still hanging in the air like a warm blanket. Flour clings to sleeves, wooden paddles lean against stone walls, and baskets stand ready for tomorrow's sales. In these little workshops, the law feels simple, almost sleepy. Rules about bread rarely stir anyone's imagination. They're measured in ounces, not scandals. You picture a town official stepping inside, scale in hand, weighing loaves in the same way you'd weigh a bag of apples today. If the loaf is short, a fine is marked. If the baker cheats too often, maybe he's barred from selling for a while. But the punishments tend to be mundane, a handful of pennies, a day in the pillory, nothing close to the drama of shutting down a brothel. Bread rules are so basic that sometimes they just get folded into guild customs. Bakers watching each other, ensuring no one undercuts too badly. Here comes the mainstream fact. In many medieval towns, bread was regulated by a long-standing system called the assize, which adjusted loaf size according to the price of grain. This way, even if wheat got expensive, people could still buy bread for a standard coin. The loaf might shrink or swell, but the price point stayed constant. It's a marvel of practical economics, and it quietly kept towns alive. Compare that to brothel regulations, which mushroomed into entire volumes, not because of practicality, but because of moral panic and taxation opportunities. And then there's the quirky tidbit, one you might not expect. Sometimes bakers found themselves accused of false bread, loaves stuffed with beans, dust, or chalk to bulk them up. Imagine biting into that surprise. The punishments were occasionally theatrical. In some places, the guilty baker had to ride backwards on a donkey through town with the bad bread hanging around his neck. That's a punishment you won't find in the brothel ordinances, oddly enough. Still, historians debate whether bread laws were more symbolic than functional. Was the assize genuinely enforced every week, or was it one of those laws that existed mostly on parchment, waved around during crises but ignored in the daily shuffle? Historians still argue whether towns had the manpower to weigh every loaf, or whether the whole system depended on guild self-policing and a few dramatic examples to scare the rest into compliance. Either way, you notice how bread enforcement rarely drew in bishops, mayors, or courts for grand deliberations. As you stand in that flour-dusted shop, you realize how calm it feels. Bread rules were predictable. Everyone knew the scales would tip this way or that depending on harvests. It wasn't a moral crisis if the loaf shrank, it was just math. You can almost hear the gentle sarcasm in your own thought. Imagine a council meeting in full robes and candles, arguing passionately about whether a rye loaf should weigh 7 or 8 ounces this week. No, they saved that theatrical energy for the stew houses. Yet bread, for all its quiet regulation, had a sacred aura. Priests broke it on altars, families built their meals around it, and famine turned its absence into riots. You can sense the contradiction. Bread mattered more for survival, but because its rules were so straightforward, it didn't generate the same legal theatre. Bread law was like the hum of a background fan, steady, necessary, rarely noticed unless it faltered. Brothel law was the noisy neighbor banging on pots at midnight. You step outside the baker's doorway again. The market square stretches before you, silent now, but in daylight it would be noisy with bread stalls, officials checking weights, guild apprentices lugging sacks of flour. You imagine yourself drifting through that bustle, the law present but not intrusive, like a clerk taking notes at the back of a classroom. And as night folds over, the difference sharpens. The bakers sleep, the bread cools, and the real action, the regulations that stir council chambers and sermon pulpits, awaits in the alleys where the lanterns never go out. You chuckle softly at the thought that bread, the foundation of survival, got treated almost like a background app, always running, rarely crashing, but never the main focus of authority. You tuck that irony away, knowing the deeper you wander into this city, the more absurd the imbalance will become. Bread fills stomachs quietly. Brothels fill law books loudly. The cobblestones under your feet seem to lead you toward the louder story, leaving the baker's flowery peace behind. Night drapes itself over the city like a velvet curtain, softening the edges of buildings and muffling the clatter of the day. You trudge along, the lantern glow bouncing off puddles and reflecting in shuttered windows, and you start noticing details you might have missed in the sun. A stray cat padding silently along a wall, the faint scent of burnt wood drifting from some distant hearth, the distant bark of a dog announcing the late hour. The city at night has a rhythm, and that rhythm is one the authorities are constantly trying to measure and manage. Bread rests in baskets, it is done for the day, but the streets themselves, alive with nocturnal energy, require far more careful oversight. You pass under the archway of the city gate and your ears pick up the distant hoot of a watchman's bell. In medieval towns, curfews were set not just to stop crime but to remind citizens that the night was dangerous. And that order must persist even after the Baker AS shutters fell. Guards patrol the streets, often armed with cudgels or staves, keeping an eye on any groups that linger too long or wander in the wrong quarter. Here the law is far more visible than it was in the quiet bread shops. Whereas a baker might be quietly fined later for underweight loaves, a constable could immediately intervene if someone disrupted the nighttime order. A mainstream historical fact surfaces. In 14th century Paris, city ordinances set strict curfews and assigned watchmen to streets known for taverns and brothels. These men were responsible for stopping fights, controlling street harassment, and ensuring that unlicensed activities didn't spread into the respectable neighborhoods. It was all part of a system designed to corral potential disorder into predictable places. This makes perfect sense when you think about how densely packed medieval cities could be, and how easy it was for a single brawl to escalate. Now for a quirky tidbit. In some towns, watchmen carried whistles made from animal horns or wooden clappers shaped like little birds. These night tweets announced danger or summoned reinforcements. Imagine wandering past one of these sleepy guards, hearing a high-pitched chirp, and realizing it wasn't a stray animal, it was law enforcement alerting the neighborhood. Scholars still argue whether these instruments were genuinely effective or more performative. A bit of theatre meant to remind citizens that even at night, someone was watching. You notice that after dark, the law seems drawn magnetically toward the more colourful and complicated parts of the city. The main street, where bakers and grocers finish their nightly chores, remains quiet. Side alleys, on the other hand, pulse with muted laughter, the occasional quarrel, and furtive footsteps. Officials, constables, watchmen, sometimes even visiting magistrates, prioritize these zones, and it's easy to see why. The potential for disorder is concentrated there, and that disorder can ripple through the town if left unchecked. As you follow the echoing footsteps, you realize the contrast with bread enforcement is stark. In the daytime, weighing loaves is a static, predictable process. At night, patrolling the streets is dynamic, reactive, and often personal. It's not just about punishing infractions, it's about preventing escalation, maintaining an appearance of control, and, frankly, showing that authority has eyes everywhere. You might even chuckle, imagining a guard stopping someone for wearing the wrong hat or carrying a suspicious bundle, all while the baker, down the lane, gets away with a loaf, a gram short. The night economy becomes apparent as you drift further. Taverns spill light onto cobblestones, music hums from a nearby inn, and laughter rises from doorways marked with discreet symbols indicating what kind of business is conducted inside. Authorities know these streets like a second skin. Their attention is deliberate, their presence a kind of soft spotlight, guiding behavior while leaving the main arteries of daily life relatively undisturbed. Quieter streets hum with a different type of law. You think about the paradox. Bread regulations were structured, repetitive, and almost invisible, whereas night patrols respond to chaos with a mix of physical presence, noise, and theatrical cues. One law is sedentary, measured, and numerical. The other is kinetic, reactive, and moral. And that difference explains a lot about why medieval officials spent far more time drafting ordinances around late-night activities than measuring flour. You pause under a lantern, listening to the distant echo of a watchman's steps, imagining yourself as both observer and participant. The city is alive not in the way a daytime market is, but with careful, tension-filled pulses that are monitored constantly. Night, disorder, and human desires demand attention in ways that bread never does. And as your eyes adjust to the shadows, you sense that the story of medieval law is as much about managing energy and spectacle as it is about survival and sustenance. You drift into the quieter quarters of the city, where lamps are few and shadows hug the walls. The smell of smoke and cooked meat mingles with the faint tang of the river, and in the half-light, the doorways that are neither market stalls nor bakeries begin to catch your eye. Here, the law seems more lenient, yet paradoxically more deliberate. You can almost hear the whispers of priests and magistrates. Necessary evil, they murmur, adjusting quills over parchment. Sex work, tolerated but not celebrated, exists under the careful scrutiny of those charged with maintaining public order. It's a strange coexistence, moral censure paired with meticulous oversight. You brush past a church spire and imagine clergy observing from the shadows, preaching against sin while quietly acknowledging the city's practical needs. A mainstream fact surfaces. Medieval cities often tolerated prostitution precisely because it was believed to protect other women and maintain social balance. Officials argued that if sex workers were allowed in controlled areas, men would be less likely to commit violence against wives, daughters, or neighbors. It was a pragmatic, if morally ambivalent calculation, better to manage the vice than pretend it doesn't exist. But there are quirks too. In some towns, workers were required to attend confession weekly or wear a token indicating they had done so, a kind of moral scoreboard. Imagine the surrealism of a yellow badge that signals both transgression and ritual compliance, like a medieval Fitbit for virtue. Historians still argue whether these practices genuinely reduced sin or merely created an elaborate theatre of morality. Either way, it's a reminder that tolerance was never total. It was structured, carefully observed, and occasionally performative. The soundscape shifts as you wander past doorways marked with discrete symbols. Laughter and music leak into the streets, punctuated by the occasional raised voice. Officials, often in plain clothes, patrol at a distance, listening, observing, recording infractions. Their goal isn't pleasure, it's containment. You notice how different this feels from the quiet enforcement of bread laws. Bread regulation is static, a matter of measuring and fining. Managing tolerated vice is kinetic, requiring intuition, presence, and an almost theatrical anticipation of trouble. You peer through a dimly lit window and see a ledger resting on a counter, coins stacked meticulously beside it. Fees, licenses, fines, all tallied to keep the city coffers full. Coin, it turns out, drives attention as much as morality. In some regions, taxes from brothels contributed significantly to municipal budgets, far exceeding what the local bakeries generated. It's ironic that the enforcement machinery hums louder where revenue and spectacle intersect, rather than where survival needs lie, and the streets themselves reflect this duality. Designated quarters separate the acceptable from the respectable red light districts, with discreet entrances and doors firmly locked at curfew. You imagine yourself walking through, feeling the careful choreography of nightly life, patrons entering, workers moving with prescribed routines, watchmen quietly observing from shadows. The moral balancing act becomes clear. On one side, churchmen preaching against sin, demanding penance. On the other, magistrates counting fees, drafting ordinances, and directing watchmen. Both sides tacitly agree on tolerance, but the reasons diverge, one spiritual, the other practical. And you sense the tension in the air, the subtle hum of control over human behavior that is not truly moralistic nor purely economic, but a strange hybrid of both. You step back into the alleyway, letting your ears and eyes adjust. The night seems quieter now, yet the energy of tolerated vice pulses faintly under the street's surface. You realize the paradox isn't just in law, it's in the city itself. Bread is essential yet boring, brothels are dangerous yet lucrative. Managing human behavior, it seems, requires more than measures and scales. It requires observation, foresight, and an almost theatrical combination of moral posturing and practical oversight. And so you trudge on, absorbing the rhythm of the streets, the glow of lanterns, and the faint hum of controlled chaos. It's a world of dualities: tolerated sin, enforced order, moral lecture, fiscal calculation. The city, in this delicate balance, feels almost alive, a living organism whose survival depends on managing both desire and discipline. You let yourself sink into that realization, the paradox comforting in its constancy, and you feel the city night fold gently around your shoulders. You continue down the twisting alleys, your footsteps echoing softly against stone walls. Lanterns cast thin pools of light, and you notice how certain streets are carefully cordoned off with signs or painted marks, subtle cues that most would overlook unless you knew their meaning. These are the lines the city draws to separate honest neighborhoods from the red light districts. The law here is territorial, almost architectural, telling citizens where vice may occur without spilling over into family spaces or holy precincts. You sense the deliberate choreography: doors closed at certain hours, lamps hung at precise intervals, boundaries reinforced by ordinances that feel more like a city's nervous system than legal code. A mainstream fact emerges. In many European towns, municipal authorities mandated that brothels be located on the periphery of city centers or near rivers and bridges. These zoning rules minimize the overlap with markets, schools, and churches. Officials hope to contain temptation, reduce conflicts, and keep the public eye on the areas where vice was concentrated. It's a stark contrast to bread regulation, which applied everywhere uniformly, every market, every street corner. Brothels, in contrast, needed boundaries, fences, and signs, both literal and legal, to exist without destabilizing society. And then there's a quirky tidbit. In some towns, city gates themselves became unofficial checkpoints. Watchmen would tally patrons entering designated districts or even require them to carry small tokens proving their payment of a local entrance fee for the quarter. You can almost see someone holding a copper disc in one hand while nervously stepping through a wrought iron gate, wondering if the constable behind the post knows more than he lets on. Scholars still argue whether these tokens were widely enforced or mostly symbolic, a method to remind people that their movements were observed, whether the watchman cared or not. You linger near one of these gates, feeling the rhythm of the district. Doors swing open with low creaks, laughter drifts into the streets, and the faint aroma of spiced wine wafts past. Officials patrol carefully, noting patterns, which doors open at which hours, who is inside, how often brawls or thefts occur. It's almost an urban choreography, a nightly ballet orchestrated by law. In contrast, the baker's world is static, a predictable morning to evening grind. Here, every step counts, every gesture is recorded in memory or ledger, and each misstep could mean fines, temporary closure, or public shame. The moral geometry is fascinating. The city doesn't outlaw desire, it contains it, guides it, monitors it, and frames it. You can feel the tension between tolerance and control. A door opens, music spills out, and you imagine officials noting that these activities must not overflow into the streets where families live or pilgrims pray. The zoning isn't just practical, it's symbolic. Red light districts are a reminder that vice is tolerated but managed, visible but circumscribed, necessary yet confined. You notice the signage too, often simple symbols like a lantern or a coloured cloth hung on a door. These were guides for patrons and constables alike, ensuring everyone understood where they could and couldn't go. Clothing codes reinforced this spatial morality, with workers wearing specific colours or badges marking their profession. You smile at the mental image, a city colour-coded like a map, with rules written not only on parchment but worn on shoulders, hats and doors. And the paradox deepens. Bread must feed the city everywhere, with rules enforced quietly, while brothels, inherently optional and morally questionable, require deliberate boundaries, complex ordinances and active management. You step over a puddle, noticing your reflection in the water as if the city itself mirrors the dual priorities of medieval law. Sustenance is mundane, control of pleasure is elaborate. You walk past the boundary again, observing the fluidity of nightlife. Patrons move in controlled flows, workers follow routines, and watchmen trace invisible lines of authority. It's a choreography that blends morality, economy, and law enforcement. You realize the city breathes through these boundaries, its heart pulsing more vigorously where human desire collides with authority. The spatial rules, the signs, the zoning, all are part of a delicate balance, designed to keep life orderly without erasing pleasure completely. And as you continue, you can feel the city guiding your path, showing you how laws draw lines not only on paper but on streets, doors, and people. You step lightly, absorbing the interplay of structure and indulgence, and you notice the gentle hum of a system that tolerates, limits, and observes all while quietly reminding you that survival and spectacle have very different weights in the medieval imagination. You follow a narrow alley that slopes toward the river, the lanterns flickering against the damp stones. Somewhere nearby, a door opens, and the faint jingling of coins drifts into the street. You realize that much of the reason brothels received so much attention from officials wasn't just moral, there was money involved. Taxes, fines, and licensing fees flowed like a quiet tributary into the city coffers, often exceeding what bakers or alehouses contributed. You notice a constable jotting notes, perhaps tallying payments or recording violations, and the practical purpose of law becomes as clear as the faint smell of spiced wine that lingers in the air. A mainstream historical fact comes to mind. In some 14th century towns, brothel licenses were not optional. Officials charged fees for operation, collected fines for infractions, and sometimes even auctioned off the right to run certain districts. These revenues were vital for municipal budgets, funding everything from road maintenance to town festivals. You can picture a ledger, neat rows of numbers documenting every coin, every violation, every day of operation. Bread might feed the city, but brothel taxes kept the city S-books balanced. And that S-why laws here are so detailed. Quirky details make the scene almost theatrical. In Toulouse, for instance, license holders had to register names and sometimes even record patrons in bound books. Imagine someone sneaking through a door and being noted down in a clerk S ledger, as if attending an official census of pleasure. Historians still argue whether these records were maintained rigorously or mostly functioned as a bureaucratic deterrent, a way to signal that authorities were always watching. As you peer through a half-open doorway, you see coins clinking in basins, tallied meticulously by clerks. The workers themselves sometimes keep separate records, knowing that a miscount could attract suspicion or fines. It's almost a dance. One hand gives coins, the other records, all while maintaining appearances and following the prescribed routines. You notice how different this is from the baker's world. A simple scale, a brief inspection, a fine or warning, and life moves on. Brothels are elaborate, performative, and revenue-driven in a way that bread cannot match. You pause on the cobblestones and reflect on how the financial aspect transforms regulation into something almost theatrical. Officials have to balance moral concerns with fiscal priorities. A violation of hygiene rules, for instance, could bring closure or fine, while a perfectly run brothel could enrich the town. In contrast, a baker cutting corners on rye might earn a slap on the wrist, but the monetary impact is comparatively small. You chuckle at the irony. The more controversial the activity, the more detailed the oversight, and the fatter the ledger entries. And it's not just coins and fines. Fees could be structured in unusual ways. In some regions, operators paid for the right to work during specific festivals or for the privilege of serving certain high-ranking patrons. The law was flexible enough to accommodate financial incentives, while rigid enough to preserve control over moral appearance. You imagine the city council deliberating over which day to auction licenses, plotting fees and penalties with the same seriousness as a modern board meeting, only with far more candle smoke. You notice the interplay between visibility and bookkeeping. Officials wanted to know who was working, when, and under what conditions, which is why these ledgers were carefully maintained. Clothing codes, badges, and sometimes even bells reinforced the law's presence, while the money flowing into town coffers ensured compliance without the need for constant enforcement. Bread required measurement, but brothels required an intricate system of observation, recording, and calculation, a balance of surveillance and revenue. You step back into the alley, letting your eyes adjust to shadows as the faint scent of bread wafts from a distant bakery. The contrast is striking. One system feeds the body quietly, the other feeds the city's authority loudly and financially. You sense why medieval magistrates, priests, and council members devoted so much energy to regulating these districts. The stakes were higher than mere morality. They involved control, profit, and the management of human behavior at every level. Coins in basins, clerks counting diligently, licenses posted on walls. This is the heartbeat of municipal law, pulsing far louder than the quiet rhythm of bread scales. You move on, stepping lightly over puddles and uneven stones, absorbing the strange blend of revenue, control, and human desire. It's clear. Managing pleasure requires a meticulous ledger, and in these streets the law thrives on both morality and money. It dances between the two with a precision that would make any modern accountant nod in grudging admiration. The alley narrows as you continue, lantern light pooling in golden puddles on the cobblestones. You notice that some doorways are more elaborate than others, adorned with small signs or discreet carvings. You realize that clothing and appearance are just as regulated as the coins counted in the basins. The city seems obsessed with visibility. If you can see it, you can control it. Sex workers wore prescribed colors, hats, or badges, and sometimes clients were marked as well. This created a kind of moving map of compliance and transgression. The law here is not just written, it's worn. A mainstream fact comes to mind. In many medieval towns, ordinances required that sex workers wear distinctive clothing. In England, for example, women might wear striped hoods or other visible markers. Clients could be subtly monitored by authorities through curfews and clothing cues. This was not simply about humiliation, it was about social engineering. It kept certain activities contained and identifiable, a visual code as important as any document or ledger. A quirky detail surfaces. In some Italian cities, officials issued small bells to certain workers. Anyone moving around the streets after curfew would announce themselves through jingling sounds. Imagine walking through a quiet alley and hearing a delicate chime, knowing someone's profession is literally ringing in the night. Scholars still argue whether such bells were effective practical tools or symbolic gestures. They may have served more to remind citizens that authorities were always present, even when unseen. As you wander, you notice the choreography. Patrons enter, workers move according to prescribed routines, and watchmen observe from strategic positions. Every movement, every glance is part of an orchestrated system of visibility and control. In contrast, a baker simply lays out bread in the morning and walks away. No bells, no stripes, no nightly watch. Here, the law enforces awareness. Everyone knows who is performing what role. The city benefits from that transparency. You pause at a corner where a constable leans lightly against a wall, keeping an eye on a busy stew house. The uniform itself acts as law, presence a constant reminder that rules are active. Bread laws are enforced with scales and measures. Brothel laws are enforced with visibility, presence, and a subtle social theatre. One loaf short and the baker faces a mild reprimand. One improperly marked door and the entire district could be cited. You watch a worker step into the street wearing her designated badge, moving with practiced grace. You notice the human element. Rules can only go so far without cooperation. Clothing codes, bells, and visible markers are part of a negotiation between authority and choice. Bread rules were quantitative and predictable. Brothel rules are qualitative, relying on cues, observation, and subtle correction. The streets feel alive with these invisible lines of law. It is a constant negotiation between what is tolerated and what is punished. Officials, priests, and watchmen rely on this system to guide behavior. The city itself becomes a theater of compliance. Every badge, every bell, every piece of clothing signals a story of authority. As you continue, you can almost hear the city's pulse, the clink of coins, soft chatter, an occasional bell. Bread may feed the stomach, but visibility feeds the city's sense of order. It reminds everyone who belongs where and under whose watchful eye. The night deepens, the streets hum, and you feel the interplay of regulation, spectacle, and human behavior settle gently around you. You follow the narrow, winding alley toward the sound of running water, the faint smell of herbs and smoke mingling with the damp stone scent of the riverbank. Ahead, a modest bathhouse hums with muted activity. Steam curls from open windows, carrying warmth into the cool night air. You pause, imagining the heat and noise inside, workers preparing tubs, clients washing, attendants handling buckets of water and fragrant oils. Hygiene in medieval cities was a serious concern, particularly in spaces where bodies gathered closely. The law, once again, is present but subtle. Rules about cleanliness, water temperature, and behavior mingling with the ordinary rhythms of city life. A mainstream historical fact emerges. By the late Middle Ages, many European municipalities required brothels and bathhouses to maintain certain standards of hygiene to prevent the spread of disease. Officials issued ordinances about cleaning tubs, changing water regularly, and even regulating the times when establishments could operate. These rules were often more detailed than those applied to ordinary households, reflecting both health concerns and social anxieties about moral contamination. And then there's the quirky side. In some cities, bathhouse attendants were required to mix specific herbal balms or oils in prescribed ratios, often recorded in municipal ledgers. Imagine the meticulous combination of rosemary, rosewater, and vinegar measured in wooden bowls, all monitored to prevent complaints of bad smells or improper heating. Scholars still argue whether these regulations were primarily about health, morality, or a performative reassurance to the public that city authorities were maintaining control over vice. Either way, it adds an almost whimsical layer to the machinery of law. You linger near the door, hearing the clatter of tubs and the murmur of voices. Officials sometimes performed surprise inspections, checking for cleanliness, verifying that attendance followed the prescribed routines, and ensuring that any fines for violations were duly levied. Compared to the slow procedural enforcement of bread weights, this is immediate, sensory, and occasionally dramatic. The flick of a ladle, the swish of hot water, the examination of herbal mixtures all become mechanisms of oversight. As you walk along, you notice how the architecture itself supports regulation. Bathhouses are often built with separate rooms for men and women, distinct entrances and strategically placed windows to allow visual inspection by supervisors without breaching privacy. You imagine constables peering discreetly through shutters, nodding at compliance or making mental notes of infractions. The system blends surveillance with respect for the function of the space, an intricate dance that balances oversight, revenue, and morality. The smell of herbs and heated water reminds you that municipal oversight extended beyond licensing and fines. In cities like Lübeck or Paris, authorities worried about outbreaks of disease, particularly sexually transmitted infections, and they framed hygiene rules as both civic responsibility and moral obligation. You can almost hear a lecture echoing faintly through the steam. Cleanliness preserves virtue and prevents scandal. Even the simplest tubs become instruments of law and social control. And the patrons themselves participate in the system. They follow timetables, respect rules about bathing and conduct, and are subtly reminded that they are being observed. Compliance becomes habitual, a way of navigating civic life without confrontation. Bread, again, is mundane: weigh, bake, sell. Hygiene in stews and bathhouses, however, is performative, visible, and moralized, weaving authority into every gesture, splash, and scrub. You step out of the bathhouse and breathe in the cooler night air. Steam lingers like mist over the cobblestones, and the distant glow of lanterns reminds you of the city's layered regulation, moral, financial, and practical. The attention lavished on hygiene, comfort, and containment of risk is another way the authorities assert control, just as coins in basins and clothing codes do. And you realize that in this nocturnal world, every sensory detail, heat, smell, touch, becomes part of the law's architecture, guiding behavior as surely as any sign or statute. The city seems alive with the quiet hum of oversight, the rituals of cleansing, and the careful choreography of bodies and officials alike. Bread may sustain the body, but these bathhouse rules sustain control, health, and order in ways that are invisible by day, yet vital by night. You continue walking, the faint hiss of water and scent of herbs following you, a reminder that even indulgence comes with obligations, oversight, and, occasionally, the gentle absurdity of regulated comfort. You follow the narrow, winding alley toward the sound of running water, the faint smell of herbs and smoke mingling with the damp stone scent of the riverbank. Ahead, a modest bathhouse hums with muted activity. Steam curls from open windows, carrying warmth into the cool night air. You pause, imagining the heat and noise inside, workers preparing tubs, clients washing, attendants handling buckets of water and fragrant oils. Hygiene in medieval cities was a serious concern, particularly in spaces where bodies gathered closely. The law, once again, is present but subtle, rules about cleanliness, water temperature, and behavior mingling with the ordinary rhythms of city life. A mainstream historical fact emerges. By the late Middle Ages, many European municipalities required brothels and bathhouses to maintain certain standards of hygiene to prevent the spread of disease. Officials issued ordinances about cleaning tubs, changing water regularly, and even regulating the times when establishments could operate. These rules were often more detailed than those applied to ordinary households, reflecting both health concerns and social anxieties about moral contamination. And then there's the quirky side. In some cities, bathhouse attendants were required to mix specific herbal balms or oils in prescribed ratios, often recorded in municipal ledgers. Imagine the meticulous combination of rosemary, rosewater, and vinegar measured in wooden bowls, all monitored to prevent complaints of bad smells or improper heating. Scholars still argue whether these regulations were primarily about health, morality, or a performative reassurance to the public that city authorities were maintaining control over vice. Either way, it adds an almost whimsical layer to the machinery of law. You linger near the door, hearing the clatter of tubs and the murmur of voices. Officials sometimes performed surprise inspections, checking for cleanliness, verifying that attendants followed the prescribed routines, and ensuring that any fines for violations were duly levied. Compared to the slow procedural enforcement of bread weights, this is immediate, sensory, and occasionally dramatic. The flick of a ladle, the swish of hot water, the examination of herbal mixtures all become mechanisms of oversight. As you walk along, you notice how the architecture itself supports regulation. Bathhouses are often built with separate rooms for men and women, distinct entrances and strategically placed windows to allow visual inspection by supervisors without breaching privacy. You imagine constables peering discreetly through shutters, nodding at compliance or making mental notes of infractions. The system blends surveillance with respect for the function of the space, an intricate dance that balances oversight, revenue, and morality. The smell of herbs and heated water reminds you that municipal oversight extended beyond licensing and fines. In cities like Lübeck or Paris, authorities worried about outbreaks of disease, particularly sexually transmitted infections, and they framed hygiene rules as both civic responsibility and moral obligation. You can almost hear a lecture echoing faintly through the steam. Cleanliness preserves virtue and prevents scandal. Even the simplest tubs become instruments of law and social control. And the patrons themselves participate in the system. They follow timetables, respect rules about bathing and conduct, and are subtly reminded that they are being observed. Compliance becomes habitual, a way of navigating civic life without confrontation. Bread, again, is mundane: weigh, bake, sell. Hygiene in stews and bathhouses, however, is performative, visible, and moralized, weaving authority into every gesture, splash, and scrub. You step out of the bathhouse and breathe in the cooler night air. Steam lingers like mist over the cobblestones, and the distant glow of lanterns reminds you of the city's layered regulation: moral, financial, and practical. The attention lavished on hygiene, comfort, and containment of risk is another way the authorities assert control, just as coins in basins and clothing codes do. And you realize that in this nocturnal world, every sensory detail, heat, smell, touch, becomes part of the law's architecture, guiding behavior as surely as any sign or statute. The city seems alive with the quiet hum of oversight, the rituals of cleansing, and the careful choreography of bodies and officials alike. Bread may sustain the body, but these bathhouse rules sustain control, health, and order in ways that are invisible by day, yet vital by night. You continue walking, the faint hiss of water and scent of herbs following you, a reminder that even indulgence comes with obligations, oversight, and, occasionally, the gentle absurdity of regulated comfort. You drift further into the city, down a street where the lanterns glow unevenly, casting long shadows that stretch like sleepy fingers across the cobblestones. Here, the presence of law is even more nuanced, focusing not only on behaviors, but on the social status and gender of those involved. Women working in brothels occupy a precarious position, their rights limited, yet shaped by municipal statutes that both protect and constrain them. You sense a mixture of dependence and regulation, survival and profit balanced against compliance and moral scrutiny. A mainstream historical fact emerges. Medieval laws often recognized sex workers as a distinct legal category. They had some rights, such as protection from assault, while performing their duties or the ability to sue in certain civil cases, yet these were tightly circumscribed by local ordinances. Their movements, work schedules, and interactions were carefully documented. It's a stark contrast to ordinary women or men in similar trades whose legal obligations might be less publicly scrutinized. Quirky details surface. In some regions, brothel workers could occasionally earn temporary privileges, such as leaving the district for a day or attending a local festival, provided they registered their absence with municipal officials. Imagine the mental checklist: permission granted, ledger updated, badge adjusted, a mixture of freedom and oversight, an almost bureaucratic dance of liberty. Historians still argue whether these privileges were genuinely empowering or merely a method to reinforce obedience and mark exceptions to the general rules. You pause at a doorway where a few women exchange coins and murmured instructions. You notice the subtleties: small gestures indicating readiness, glances that communicate compliance, and the careful observation of watchmen stationed discreetly nearby. The city's law is embedded in social interaction as much as in written statutes. Each woman's choice, every action is mapped against municipal expectations. Compared to a baker's day, where measuring loaves is routine and impersonal, these streets pulse with living, adaptive regulation. The economic side cannot be ignored. Workers' earnings are logged, fines or fees deducted, and licenses validated, forming a complex financial ecosystem. Coin flow is a marker of legality, and the city depends on it. In this context, moral oversight and economic control merge seamlessly. A worker's daily behavior ensures both tax compliance and the maintenance of order. You can almost hear the city ledger ticking silently, recording each interaction with precision. Architecture contributes to control as well. Courtyards, narrow hallways, and specific door arrangements channel movement, preventing conflicts, enhancing visibility, and allowing constables to monitor discreetly. You notice how social and physical design intersect with law, shaping behavior almost unconsciously. The rules are written not only on parchment, but into the very streets, doors, and spatial layout. You step back, imagining the blend of obligation, choice, and surveillance. Women in these districts navigate legal constraints and social norms while negotiating personal survival. Bread is measured. Life in brothels is observed, structured, and recorded. The city functions like a living organism. The bakers sustain it quietly, while the regulated districts pulse with energy, revenue, and the intricate balance of social control. As you continue along the cobblestones, you notice the soft rhythm of the night: coins, whispers, creaking doors, and watchmen's steady patrols. The streets are a theater of legality and survival, a living testament to how laws prioritize management of human desire over mundane sustenance. You feel the paradox settle around you: women on the margins, the city watching, and the quiet hum of authority maintaining order in every shadow. You find yourself walking back toward the market square, where the faint smell of cooled bread lingers in the night air. The contrast between the bustling, regulated streets of vice and the calm, orderly world of bakers is striking. Guild halls loom silently, their wooden doors closed, the scales resting until morning. Bread rules feel almost like a background hum now, predictable, routine, and unremarkable. And yet, when you compare these quiet measures to the complex machinery of brothel oversight, the difference is like night and day. A mainstream fact surfaces: medieval guilds maintained strict regulations over bakers, from the weights of loaves to permissible pricing. Fines were issued for deviations, and apprentices were trained meticulously to comply with every guideline. Assizes, periodic inspections, and peer monitoring ensured consistency. Bread mattered. It literally kept the city alive, But its regulation was largely static, predictable, and carried little dramatic flair. Now for a quirky detail. In some towns, bakers who repeatedly violated the assize could be subjected to unusual punishments, like carrying a loaf publicly or parading through the market with flour on their heads. Imagine the town chuckling at a baker's humiliation while life continued uninterrupted. Scholars still argue whether such punishments were common or reserved for extreme cases, but either way, the theatre of regulation was minimal compared to the nightly choreography of red-light districts. You wander past closed bakeries, noticing the neat piles of empty baskets and wooden paddles. Guild apprentices sweep floors, ready for the next day's work, while the masters enjoy the quiet certainty of their craft. Bread is essential, yes, but the rules are transparent, enforceable, and mostly uncontroversial. The contrast with brothel districts where clothing codes, bells, licensing, and moral oversight intersected with human behavior is glaring. Bread is numbers, brothels are theatre. Financially, bread contributes steadily but modestly to municipal coffers, with fines for underweight loaves or late deliveries. Brothels, by contrast, generate revenue that is highly visible, recorded in detailed ledgers, and often sufficient to influence local budgets. The law's intensity is proportional to the stakes. Bread sustains life. Vice sustains authority and finances. You can't help but smirk at the irony. Survival is quiet. Spectacle pays. The guild's authority is largely self-reinforcing. Apprentices train each other, masters inspect, and fines act as reminders. There's no need for patrols, badges, or bells. You notice the elegance of this system. Compliance comes naturally, enforcement is predictable, and the risk to public order is minimal. Contrast that with the nightly work of watchmen in brothel quarters, whose patrols, documentation, and surveillance must constantly adapt to human unpredictability. You pause near a shuttered bakery, thinking about the sensory difference. The scent of bread is comforting, the work rhythm gentle, and the law operates invisibly. In brothel districts, every sense is engaged. Coins clinking, laughter spilling, doors creaking, bells jingling, smells of herbs and wine mixing with human activity. Bread is simple, almost soothing. Vice is dynamic, interactive, and morally charged. And the streets themselves reflect these priorities. Markets are open, orderly, predictable. Brothel quarters are dynamic, policed, and constantly negotiated. The contrast illustrates a central paradox. Life-sustaining goods require simple oversight, while morally or socially risky activities demand complex performative regulation. The city's heartbeat is therefore split, a slow, steady pulse for bread and a fast, reactive rhythm for pleasure and disorder. You walk on, noting the cobblestones underfoot, the closed guild doors, and the faint aroma of rye and wheat. Bread rules are steady, almost comforting in their constancy, but you feel drawn toward the energy and unpredictability of the streets where human desires collide with municipal authority. The contrast is more than logistical, it's philosophical, reflecting a city that values spectacle, order, and revenue in unexpected ways. You wander through a dreamlike version of Europe now, the streets folding into one another as if the city itself is a map you can walk freely. You drift past the familiar cobbles of your previous explorations and enter a mental montage of three distinct towns: London, Toulouse, and Lübeck. Each city has its own flavor of regulation, yet a curious pattern emerges. Despite differences in culture, language, and municipal structure, authorities everywhere devote far more attention to red light districts than to the bread markets that sustain their populations. The priorities are clear: control desire, preserve order, and maximize revenue. A mainstream fact. London in the 14th century had designated prostitution zones along certain streets near the river, where licenses were required and fees meticulously recorded. Toulouse relied on similar zoning, but officials also required weekly confession for workers and periodic health inspections. Lübeck, a Hanseatic port, integrated brothel regulation into broader municipal surveillance, combining curfews, badges, and patrols to ensure compliance. Each city had its unique methods, yet all demonstrate the same underlying principle: pleasure must be managed, quirky details jump out. In Toulouse, some brothel licenses were passed from one operator to another via auctions, sometimes for significant sums, while London occasionally demanded that workers carry identifying tokens when crossing from one district to another. Lübeck had ordinances that required certain colours of clothing to distinguish between different classes of workers. Scholars still argue whether these measures were more about moral oversight, practical administration, or fiscal exploitation. Probably a little of all three. You notice subtle variations in enforcement. In London, constables walked the riverfront at night, checking licenses and patrolling the docks, ensuring that activities didn't spill into residential areas. In Toulouse, church officials sometimes accompanied secular authorities, blending moral supervision with civic oversight. Lübeck relied on a combination of civic guards and watchmen to monitor compliance and prevent disorder, a system almost militaristic in its precision. Each city adapts the same principles to local circumstances: zoning, surveillance, and documentation. You step mentally into the alleys, observing the choreography of nightly life. Each city has created its own language of control: badges, bells, signs, and coins flowing into ledgers. Patrons, workers, and officials all learn the rules through observation and repetition. Compliance becomes second nature, a social contract reinforced by both fear and habit. Bread, meanwhile, is quietly regulated through numbers and inspections, requiring none of the dramatic choreography of urban surveillance. The interplay between moral theatre and revenue is fascinating. In Toulouse, failure to attend confession could result in fines or temporary closure, intertwining spiritual oversight with municipal authority. In London, unlicensed operators risked confiscation of profits or imprisonment, a mixture of moral and fiscal enforcement. Lübeck's combination of curfew, signage, and patrol illustrates the same principle. Law is performative, visible, and responsive to human behavior, not just recorded in parchment. You pause, absorbing the patterns across these cities. It's clear that the medieval mindset prioritizes order over sustenance, spectacle over simplicity. Bread feeds the body quietly. Brothels feed authority, revenue, and social control loudly. Zoning, patrols, tokens, and clothing codes are all part of a delicate architecture that transcends geography. Nightlife becomes a stage on which law is enacted, observed, and negotiated in real time. Walking through these three cities in your mind, you notice how universal the priorities are: manage risk, collect revenue, and guide human desire without letting it overwhelm the community. Bread, steady and essential, gets predictable oversight. Brothels, dynamic and risky, get elaborate rules, detailed surveillance, and constant attention. The contrast is almost poetic, illustrating a medieval world where moral theatre and practical governance are inseparable, shaping city life far more than the quiet scales of a baker ever could. You drift deeper into the maze of medieval streets, feeling the night air grow cooler, carrying the faint aroma of wood smoke mixed with lingering scents from the river. The cobbles beneath your feet echo with distant footsteps, whispers, and the occasional clink of coins. You realize that this world, meticulously regulated yet seemingly chaotic, relies on observation, routine, and subtle social cues as much as written law. Every alley, every doorway, every lantern contributes to the city's intricate system of control. A mainstream historical fact comes into view. City ordinances often detail the precise locations, operating hours, and behaviors permitted within brothels. Officials mandated closing times, regular inspections, and fines for violations. These measures were widespread across Europe, from small towns to bustling ports, reflecting a belief that vice must be corralled rather than eradicated. Bread, by comparison, required routine measurement but rarely provoked such extensive documentation or public oversight. Quirky details emerge. In some German towns, officials maintained separate ledgers for moral infractions, including breaches of dress codes or curfew violations, in addition to financial records. These entries could be surprisingly granular, noting small gestures, arguments, or even minor disputes over payment. Scholars still argue whether these records were truly enforced, or primarily served as a performative display of authority to maintain the appearance of order. Either way, the effort invested is remarkable, especially when compared to the simplicity of enforcing bread weights. You pause to observe a lantern-lit street corner where a few constables linger. Their presence is as much about deterrence as intervention. A subtle glance or a firm stance can prevent disputes before they escalate. Meanwhile, the workers in the area understand the rhythm: entry, interaction, transaction, exit. Every action is regulated by expectation, spatial design, and social norms. Bread, in contrast, operates with almost mechanical predictability: knead, bake, measure, sell. The difference is stark. Financial incentives are entwined with morality. Licensing fees, fines, and token systems ensure revenue flows smoothly into municipal coffers. Officials maintain a delicate balance, encourage compliance, maximize income, and prevent scandal from spilling into the rest of the city. Coins clink in basins while officials record each transaction meticulously, the audible rhythm reinforcing accountability. Bread may feed bodies, but brothels feed both authority and treasury. Architecture itself enforces compliance. Narrow alleys, courtyards, and controlled entrances allow constables to monitor activity unobtrusively. Visual codes, colored clothing, badges, bells augment the legal framework, providing a silent yet powerful reminder of oversight. Patrons and workers alike navigate these spatial rules, internalizing the boundaries set by both law and practice. Compliance becomes habitual, almost instinctive, reflecting an intricate fusion of observation, regulation, and social negotiation. You walk slowly, absorbing the layered complexity of human behavior and municipal control. Every action, glance, and transaction becomes part of the city's rhythm, a nocturnal choreography of law, commerce, and morality. Bread sustains quietly, predictably. Brothels sustain order, spectacle, and revenue, demanding constant attention, creativity, and enforcement. The streets are alive with these intertwined priorities, and you feel their pulse as vividly as the clinking coins, jingling bells, and distant footsteps echoing in the alleyways. It occurs to you that the medieval city thrives on contrasts: quiet, predictable sustenance versus loud, dynamic oversight, private acts versus public scrutiny, simple regulation versus performative, adaptive governance. And you realize the deeper lesson: managing human behavior, desire, morality, and compliance requires far more than scales and weights. It demands observation, ritual, and the careful orchestration of both law and social expectation. The city feels heavier now, the night stretching long and quiet, yet vibrating subtly with human presence. Lanterns cast gentle halos, and distant voices echo off stone walls, soft but persistent. You notice how every doorway, every alley, every flicker of light is part of a carefully maintained system of observation and control. Brothel districts, with their signs, badges, and coins, are alive with oversight, while bakeries and markets remain quietly asleep. The contrast is almost philosophical. Sustenance is simple, desire is complex, and the law bends to match the challenge. A mainstream historical fact comes to mind. Municipal authorities frequently maintained regular inspections of licensed brothels, sometimes weekly or even daily, depending on the town and its priorities. These inspections were often multifaceted. They checked for cleanliness, verified licenses, recorded fees, and ensured that workers adhered to prescribed dress codes and behavior. Bread enforcement, by contrast, relied on periodic assizes and scale checks, a necessary but far less intensive exercise. A quirky tidbit surfaces. In some French towns, women accused of violating dress or curfew codes were made to wear symbolic markers temporarily, akin to a medieval "you've been naughty" tag. These markers were both practical and performative, serving as immediate visual cues of compliance, or lack thereof. Historians still argue whether these markers genuinely enforced discipline or mostly functioned as a form of public theatre to demonstrate authority. You continue along a narrow street where coins and laughter intertwine, the subtle cadence of commerce, social negotiation, and surveillance blending into one hypnotic rhythm. Every participant, the worker, the patron, the constable, understands their role in the choreography. You sense the city as a living organism where law flows through the streets like blood, balancing moral oversight, fiscal interest, and public order. Bread, again, is steady and predictable. Brothels demand constant attention, negotiation, and energy. Spatial design enforces law in ways you begin to notice more clearly. Narrow alleys focus movement, courtyards provide observation points, and strategic lighting ensures that illicit or risky behavior can be monitored without constant intervention. Watchmen rely on anticipation, pattern recognition, and subtle social signals. Unlike Baker's predictable routines, the streets of desire are dynamic and reactive, requiring vigilance at every turn. The city's moral calculus is fascinating. Licensing, fees, inspections, clothing codes, and curfews all intersect to create a network of control. Workers comply, patrons adapt, and officials adjust their presence according to observed behavior. Coins, signs, and bells create a tactile, audible system of accountability. Bread regulation is almost invisible in comparison, a quiet mathematical oversight, whereas brothel regulation is performative, social, and sensory. As you pause on a stone step, watching shadows flicker across walls, the complexity of the system becomes almost hypnotic. The city thrives on contrasts: predictability versus improvisation, sustenance versus spectacle, silent compliance versus visible oversight. Every lantern, coin, and badge is a note in the city's nocturnal symphony, and you feel yourself attuned to its rhythm. The streets are alive, pulsing with law, order, and human desire, and you sense that understanding this balance is key to understanding medieval urban life itself. Finally, you walk on, aware that the night is drawing toward its end. The city hums softly around you, a living testament to how laws, both mundane and moral, shape human behavior and maintain social equilibrium. Bread, simple and steady, feeds the body. Brothels, complex and performative, feed the machinery of order, authority, and societal management. And in that realization, you feel the pulse of medieval life in every shadow, echo, and flickering lantern. You drift toward the outer edges of the city now, where the lanterns thin and the echoes of laughter and clinking coins fade into a gentle murmur. The streets widen slightly, cobblestones giving way to compacted earth, and you feel the city exhale after its nightly performance. You notice that even in these quieter spaces, the echoes of regulation linger. The patterns of curfew, the placement of markers, and the distant watchman's silhouette on a rooftop remind you that authority never truly sleeps. Bread rests in quiet shops, brothels close, yet the structures of oversight continue, invisible but persistent. A mainstream historical fact settles into your mind. By the 15th century, many European towns had formalized the inspection and monitoring of licensed brothels into systematic routines. Officials maintained detailed records, documented violations, and ensured compliance through a combination of observation, fees, and social signaling. This bureaucratic attention far exceeded the oversight given to food markets, reflecting a city deeply invested in controlling desire, behavior, and public perception. Quirky details emerge as you picture the subtle theatricality of enforcement. In Lübeck, for instance, guards occasionally used coded lantern signals to indicate whether areas were being monitored or clear, a sort of silent communication that informed both workers and patrons. Scholars still debate how effective these systems truly were, or if they functioned more as symbolic reminders of authority than practical tools. Either way, the ingenuity is notable, combining surveillance, social compliance, and a kind of nocturnal choreography that turns the streets themselves into instruments of law. You continue along the dirt path, imagining the contrast between bakeries and brothels. The baker's world is ordered, quantitative, and largely predictable. Weigh, measure, fine, repeat. Brothels demand a ballet of oversight, moral and economic negotiation, and constant vigilance. Clothing codes, bells, tokens, coins, and curfews create an intricate web where every participant, worker, client, constable, understands the rules and the consequences of transgression. Bread sustains life quietly, brothels sustain control, spectacle, and revenue loudly. The architecture reinforces oversight. Narrow streets, designated courtyards, and strategically placed doors allow authorities to monitor discreetly while maintaining privacy. Patrons and workers navigate these spaces with an awareness of scrutiny that is as much psychological as legal. The streets themselves become instruments of municipal authority, channeling human behavior into predictable patterns while permitting a controlled expression of desire. Financial oversight merges with morality seamlessly. Fees, fines, and licenses create both incentive and constraint, ensuring that municipal coffers benefit while moral standards appear maintained. You can almost hear the clink of coins in basins, a reminder that governance often relies on both economy and ethics. The city thrives on this balance: order and indulgence, regulation and revenue, morality and pragmatism, all interwoven into the nocturnal rhythm. You notice how each district, each doorway, each lantern forms part of a larger system, a living network that enforces compliance without overt violence. The streets pulse with law and life simultaneously. Coins jingle, bells chime, footsteps echo, and constables observe silently. Bread, essential but mundane, is secondary in terms of the city's attention. Pleasure, risk, and revenue command the elaborate mechanisms of control that shape human behavior. And as you step into the quiet of the city outskirts, the hum of human activity softens. You sense the layers of regulation, the interplay between law and social expectation, and the careful choreography that sustains both order and indulgence. Medieval law, you realize, thrives where human desire intersects with oversight, crafting a complex living system that balances morality, revenue, and social stability far more intricately than the simple measures of daily sustenance ever could.